is now sharing the slides, and I hope you can all hear me. It's great to be here. As Carolyn said, we are from the Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership at the OU, where our work focuses on leadership and collaboration in the third sector. And this project is a project we've started only recently, and it really has come out of our relationships with infrastructure organisations during the lockdown and prior to the lockdown, and talking to them through that period and beginning to reflect on that. So this is an outline of how that reflection and that empirical work will proceed, and we're looking forward to your feedback. On the next slide, you'll see that we start with some assumptions, and those are really that local infrastructure organisations have been somewhat marginalised in recent years, in policy and in attention perhaps from academia as well. And so we're looking to address that at a time when local infrastructure organisations have been really important, and yet in the media during COVID-19, that's not really the story that we've heard. We've heard a lot about the national programmes for volunteering. We've heard quite a lot about local community organisations. And so we're looking to fill that gap and really discuss the role of local infrastructure organisations. Our aims in the research are therefore to formalise some of the anecdotal knowledge that we have and some of the stories that we've heard, to draw out insights from practice, and as well to contribute to the academic understanding of the role of infrastructure, the contribution that infrastructure organisations make to place leadership, and the ethical leadership dilemmas that arise as leadership is practiced. So as you would expect from a Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership, we bring a leadership lens to this discussion. And therefore, we're just going to pause for 1 second to say something about the approach we take to leadership in the Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership. Following Raylan, we tend to think of leadership as a practice rather than a person. In other words, we're concerned with what people do, the actions that they take, their day-to-day activities, the way in which leadership happens. It's often said around the water cooler and in the kitchen and in the coffee shop, and just the everyday practice of leadership, rather than in particularly the idea of the heroic individual leaders. So we see leadership as relational and focus attention on the social interactions of leadership rather than formal position and hierarchy. And we're interested in the way in which different actors interact together in a complex system, and that particularly relates to leadership of place and the way in which in a particular place, people from different organisations and different actors come together and make things happen. And we also draw on the idea from Hyperts that leadership has no easy answers. In other words, leadership is concerned with dealing with often wicked problems, complex issues to which there's not a linear single answer. So taking these lenses to leadership, we then come to look at local infrastructure organisations. I'm handing over to Daniel here.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, so I'm going to run through some of the overall context and some of the issues about infrastructure, particularly for people if you're not familiar with the term, and actually some of the issues I'm going to raise touch on some of the things that have been spoken about over the last, well, certainly yesterday, and some things in the plenary as well this morning. So generally, infrastructure organisations, they have a very long history, pretty much as long as there have been voluntary sector organisations. There's been some form of structure, and that started initially sort of at a national level, trying to organise things. But more recently, infrastructure organisations have been organised across various multiple geographical scales, as Walton and Macmillan have drawn attention to. And our work's going to look at local infrastructure organisations, and we're defining those really as the ones that are working across multiple neighbourhoods and communities, but not across counties. So not regional, focused more locally, but certainly across community boundaries and multiple neighbourhoods. And there are hundreds of those organisations in the UK. A quick look at NAVCA's website will show you the ones that are members of NAVCA, which is the National Association for Voluntary and Community Action, national infrastructure, if you like. but John Mohan's done some research on that as well a few years ago now, but still very much relevant. And then the recent history is much like the rest of the sector up to March, up to the COVID crisis, particularly defined by austerity, which has led to reduced funding and closures as well. So yeah, very similar sort of concerns and issues. So what is infrastructure? A fundamental question. Various definitions exist, but generally they all see as consistent this idea of providing physical spaces and facilities, so community centres, meeting rooms, etc. Maybe office space for other organisations, that kind of stuff. Structures, so like community forums, there might be voluntary sector forums, maybe volunteer forums, development workers forums, those kinds of things. Systems in place, so funding systems, policy issues, impact evidence. Maybe it might be that they provide quality marks, such as, so for example, Voluntary Action Calderdale have their quality for health mark, things like that, systems in place. Relationships, and that's within and amongst communities, the voluntary sector, formal groups themselves, relationships upwards to local government, national government even, etc. People, obviously very closely related to relationships, knowledge about the sector, about how to run organisations, how to set organisations up, etc. Skills, and very importantly, direct services is something that gets sometimes forgotten in terms of the offer of infrastructure organisations, and I'll touch on that a little bit in a moment as well. So there are lots of challenges to local infrastructure organisations. Fundamentally, often they tend to be, as Carol said, the forgotten element of the sector, often because the focus of local infrastructure organisations is on promoting their local sector and the organisations within that, so and the communities that they serve as well. So it can be difficult to pay attention to the specific infrastructure offer and the internal organisational needs, not least because measuring the impact of local infrastructure work is really difficult. I mentioned direct service earlier, and that can be a little bit contentious because organisations involved in infrastructure are often seen as honest brokers between the sector and funders, and so them delivering direct services can be seen as slightly controversial because of that. But as I said, it's historically been part of the local infrastructure organisation offer, and certainly in the Wolfenden report it was identified as a fundamental part of that offer. John Mohan's work from Third Sector Research Centre points out that infrastructure organisations typically have relationships with less than 30% of the voluntary sector organisations in their area. That research looked at registered charities. So if it's I think it's between 10 and 30% of registered charities. So if we talk about less formal groups, you would imagine that number is lower as well. So that presents a challenge. And because of that, Osborne, in relation to sort of co-production and representation, has spoken about how that creates a risk of a self-perpetuating elite of a certain group of people that continually contribute to, say, for example, policy developments with local government, and that can lead to a lack of engagement with marginalised voices, a lack of diversity, etc. And as was mentioned earlier on in the plenary, in relation to COVID specifically, we've seen in crisis disaster situations, internationally mainly, that community responses can present problems for formal organisations. And we've spoken a lot, if people were in the mutual aid session yesterday, about the challenges that mutual aid present for more formal sector organisations. So in theory, local infrastructure can be one of the solutions to these fundamental challenges, because of the approach that infrastructure takes in relation to building responses that are catalytic. The work that they do is catalytic. One thing leads to another thing, and it's about capacity building, to use that term, both horizontally across the sector, so building the skills within the sector, building on the assets and what exists currently, and vertically as well, encouraging organisations and communities to be involved in strategic decision making, partnerships, collaborations, etc., and to address those power imbalances. A lot of that you see with the emphasis on bottom-up working, etc. Yeah, so in relation to the coronavirus response specifically, we know from a lot of what's been presented that the infrastructure organisations have been doing a lot in local areas, but there is variation within that depending on a lot of the pre-existing issues within different organisations and different communities, funding not least. We've seen the Never More Needed hashtag on that was mentioned earlier, and it's on Twitter, but there's also the Heart of Our Community hashtag, which is complementary to that, which focuses specifically on infrastructure. Very often that response is articulated as sort of doing, so connecting, communicating, supporting, sharing. And we've seen that with the Voluntary Acts in Sheffield presentation, which was in session 2B yesterday, and the work that they've done locally. 2
minutes, Daniel.
Thanks, Carolyn. And so we've also seen links with non-sector organisations. Again, private businesses were spoken about earlier on, pharmacies, for example, delivering medicines, that kind of thing. Definitely concerns about people falling through the net, which has prompted a focus on specific communities. And the example from Birmingham earlier, where the response has been very quick to try and identify some of those issues and try and address them quite quickly. Also, infrastructure organisations do sector surveys. Again, it was something that was mentioned about Birmingham, but it's something that happens sort of as a matter of course, and they're going to be really valuable to identify some of the issues that are presented by coronavirus. But there are some questions about, Carol mentioned earlier, leadership. Who is leading this stuff? How does infrastructure exist as part of strong voluntary sector infrastructure, as part of stronger community infrastructure or resilience, as was mentioned earlier, and the issue of volunteering. Also, the emphasis on the new, which was mentioned earlier, and the mutual aid report that came out recently did identify this fact and say that, well, actually, some of the stuff that people are calling mutual aid was happening anyway. It's stuff that's going on already in these areas. It might not be called mutual aid, even though these things are happening. And certainly infrastructure organisations have been doing things like delivering shopping, befriending, all that kind of stuff in the recent past before COVID happened. So in terms of our design, just very, very briefly to finish off, we're going to do a 12-month project. We've just started it, hopefully between 3 and 5 LIOs as case studies, plus a bit of national context from NAVCA and partners. We're going to select those through our existing relationships, but also if anyone else wants to come along and have a chat about it, we're more than open to that and welcome that. And 3 primary methods: the public available materials, internal documents, communications, if we can get our hands on those and people are willing to do that, so we can see how organisations have really been working, and then interviews with the key individuals. And we're going to do a fairly, hopefully straightforward thematic analysis of that. And that's it. Happy to take questions in a little bit, and references there for you. That's the end. All done. Let me take this off.
You're on mute, Carolyn.
Sorry. Thank you to the 2 of you, and I note that you have said that you're happy for people to get in touch with you, and they may have local infrastructure organisations of their own that they want to be part of that research. So now Jill and Sam, so Jill Anderson and Sam Richards from the Lancaster District Voluntary and Community Solutions, are going to share with us about embedding a culture of learning. Thank you both.
Great. Thank you very much, Carolyn. It's great to be here today from Lancaster and to follow, really good, I think, to be following Carol and John. So our presentation is called Embedding a Culture of Learning, Lancaster District Community and Voluntary Solutions and its Sounding Board. So LDCVS is a district-wide infrastructure organisation, and as a CVS, it's been around for nearly 50 years in Lancaster. The organisation is fairly small. At the start of the pandemic, we had only 4 employees, now increased to 7. And like many other infrastructure organisations, our team's work has intensified and diversified significantly over recent months in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Sam and I are members of LDCVS's 7-person board, Sam long-standing and me a little newer, and Yak Patel, our Chief Executive Officer, has also been involved in putting this presentation together. Prior to the pandemic, our board met every 2 months, face-to-face, in the cornerstone, which you can see in the top left of this slide, which is a welcoming community building in the centre of Lancaster. And since lockdown, we've been meeting online every Friday morning, pretty much without fail. That change just seemed to happen. As one trustee said,
all I remember is that we seemed to first of all find ourselves meeting by video conference, which we'd not done before, and almost by some process of osmosis came up with this notion that we ought to be meeting much more regularly. I don't remember it being a very long discussion.
In this presentation, we draw on planned conversations with other board members to explore the impact of that sudden shift in our practice on our own learning and on the governance of our organisation. We spoke first to fellow trustees, and then we asked our CEO, Jack, to reflect on the views we gathered. We had a sense when we put this abstract together that we had moved towards being a more effective sounding board for Jack, but we wanted to explore other aspects of the change as well. So
what did we ask? We said to those that we spoke to, and you can see photographs of our smiling faces here, the LDCVS board has been meeting weekly online since March. How has that affected you as an individual, and how do you feel it has impacted on us as a board and on our organisation?
And here is what our fellow trustees said about the positives. There was consensus that as a board we've become more effective and more engaged. As one person said,
we've all got stuck in. Our knowledge has improved immeasurably and our contribution with it.
Another of our trustees said this.
Before, we seemed to spend a lot of time seeking information, seeking explanations, probing, trying to understand and so on. Now, there's a lot less of that. And I think a lot more of people putting their hand up. I'll do that. It's a much more collaborative and constructive way of using the resource of the board.
If there's been more action, there's been more listening to. We've been available for consultation, in particular around staff well-being issues, in a way that we feel we weren't before. Reflecting on the past few months, Jack, our CEO, said,
you've had a really good understanding of the needs and pressures on the wider team. I could have been threatened by that involvement, but I think I've been quite open to suggestions.
So what has been behind all this change? Well, firstly, we feel that we've got to know each other better, forming and doing some storming as a group and learning about each other's strengths and weaknesses. Perhaps the way that working on Microsoft Teams takes us into one another's houses has been one aspect of that shift. And secondly, we've had much more detailed, in-depth discussion. It's felt easier to review things and to change tack. As one person said,
things have moved around a little bit. We've changed our ideas from week to week, and we've had discussion about the same thing a couple of times, I think with different views. So we thought we've agreed something, and then we found out, no, we haven't agreed it.
Yeah. And thirdly, things have somehow loosened up. One of our members recalled the situation before COVID kicked off.
I used to find that the interactions between the people on the board were relatively formal, relatively stiff, a lot of depending on procedures and protocols and so on. Of course, that's not unnatural when a group of people come together only every 6 to 8 weeks.
Now, he says, things feel more fluid. Meeting dates and times are more flexible, and it's easier if we miss one meeting, for instance, to keep up to speed. So there was consensus from our conversations that things have moved forward over this period. But what of some of the negatives?
Firstly, online meetings are challenging to chair effectively. It can be harder to read the room. As one trustee said,
it's one of the constraints of online meetings, oddly enough, is you can only hear voices individually and somehow in series. I've noticed something, we've been chatting, and I've been feeling not quite in tune with others. And I have to observe the meeting etiquette. I miss the moment to make the point.
Secondly, some work feels more difficult online. As one trustee said of our business planning process,
I think people have understood different things by the term business plan. Quite wildly different things, you know, very different things. I think if we'd been meeting physically and we'd have been able to do some brainstorming, that might have progressed our understanding better.
there have, that is, been constraints on our creativity. Thirdly, there has been a danger of overcommitment. Many of us have been putting a lot of time in over recent months. Weekly meetings have been a big ask of our CEO, who has been having to account for his work more frequently in a wider context where his workload has intensified. This is true for board members too. As one trustee said,
"We are all volunteers. People didn't sign up for it at the start. We reacted to a situation, and I think we reacted well, very well. But I think there's some level of fatigue, so it's not something we can keep up forever."
there was an associated concern that those who were unable or not wishing to put in so much time might feel sidelined or not integrated. Finally, there was a perceived danger of overstepping our role. As one trustee said,
"The good thing about this board is that it stepped up to that mark at this time. Whether we can sustain or whether we should sustain that in the future is another matter. We've got to be careful we don't end up trying to run the organisation, because that's what we employ our CEO for. We'll get into all sorts of trouble if we try and do that."
just before moving on to our final thoughts, we wanted to touch on our CEO's reactions to the initial draft of our presentation. He told us,
"I was really happy to read this, actually, delighted. It really engaged me and it chimed with thoughts that I've had too."
our subsequent conversation with him, drawing out his own answers to the questions that we posed to trustees, has informed what you have heard this morning.
So that is what we found. Was it what we all expected? Not for one long-standing member. Reflecting on the picture that he had presented, he said,
I think it's been a big revelation, actually. The way we were doing things before was how we'd always done it, but that has changed. And you know, if we hadn't had this situation, we probably would still be doing the same thing. It didn't occur to us to think that we could do anything different.
So the sense that emerges from our conversations is one of ongoing change. And interestingly, it's not just that specific things have had to change because of the pandemic, but that suddenly everything feels more open to change. One aspect of that change is our increased engagement as trustees, not only with staff and fellow board members, but with the wider community. Ironically, despite becoming more virtual, we seem to have become more hands-on. So will that change again? Some think that there may be a retrenchment, a stepping back, but others see little likelihood of a return to the old normal. At the very least, because we've stepped up our learning, not only about the organisation and its wider context, but about each other and ourselves. In that process, as well as becoming a more effective sounding board for our CEO, we've begun as a board to make more sound. Our voices have grown stronger. So what does our future hold? it seems likely to include a rebalancing of our areas of involvement, a move to a mix of face-to-face and online meetings, and a clearer development strategy for us as trustees. Our challenge now is to move forward in ways that continue to ensure sound governance. Thank you very much for listening, and we'd welcome any questions.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Sam, for that view from Lancaster. And I loved the ironing board picture. I'll have to practice some more of that. Now, so our fourth paper is from Fay Holland of Groundwork UK, Community Action in a Pandemic. And so I'll call on Fay to share her screen and do the presentation. And I'd like at this point to thank the presenters. They're doing very good job at keeping to time. Thanks, Fay. Just unmute yourself, Fay, you right?
Yep. Sorry, I lost the unmute button, but yeah, good to go now. Thanks very much. Yeah, so this research is about community groups and their experience in the pandemic. So we know that COVID-19 has had a huge impact on individuals and organisations all across the globe. And while headlines are dominated by big businesses and large charities or mutual aid groups, which are often assumed to be a new phenomenon rather than building on existing social infrastructure, the experience of existing grassroots community groups working on a hyper-local level has seemed to us to often fly under the radar. So this research has looked at how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted local community groups, what role they've played in the emergency response, and how they can be empowered to support communities through a protected period of change and recovery. So I work at a charity called Groundwork UK, and we are a federation of charities mobilising practical community action on poverty and the environment. We work with community groups in our delivery and our projects in lots of ways, in partnership, sometimes facilitating, providing space for them. And we also administrate grant programmes for small grassroots community groups such as the Tesco Bags of Help Fund. So we're interested in this topic because we want to know how better to support community groups and empower them to achieve their goals. So the sources that this is drawing on is a survey of community groups which we carried out between June and July 2020, and that was groups that were part of our networks on our newsletter list and often had previously been grant recipients. We looked at grant data from the Tesco Bags of Help COVID-19 Communities Fund, which was an emergency fund which opened at the start of April, distributing £4 million in £500 grants and designed to get that funding out quickly for groups that needed to either adapt or scale up their work. And we also carried out semi-structured interviews with 86 community groups who were invited to participate after taking part in the survey, and that was carried out by volunteers from some of our corporate partners. So the definition of community groups we've used is quite broad, and we allow groups to sort of self-define into this category. But it's more to do with scale than structure. So the majority were community or voluntary organisations, small local charities, community interest companies. We had things like sports clubs, hospices, food banks, parish councils, social enterprises, local arts and heritage groups, friends of parks groups, a wide range of different community groups. And what we saw was that it had been a hugely disruptive event for community groups. So just 1% of those that responded to the survey said that there had been no impact on them. 62% were actually saying that they'd closed or reduced services. 30% had changed or adapted, and then 6% had increased their services. So that varied quite a lot between what kind of group they were. So for example, food banks were much more likely to have increased their services, whereas sports clubs had mostly reduced or closed services. And the financial impact had been really stark. So we saw that 80% of community groups had a reduction in income, and despite the sort of new emergency funding that was available from various sources, it seems like relatively few have seen an increase or changed their source of income through those channels. And as most groups was telling us, that was because they were quite reliant on face-to-face fundraising and revenue from events for their income. So those were really big barriers for them. And most reported a rising need in their communities. So even though they might be scaling back what they're doing, they're aware that the need is growing as a result of the lockdown. And that's against a backdrop of a survey we did last spring, which asked about levels of need changing over time, and almost half were saying that there had been rising need in their communities in the previous 5 years. So that's against a backdrop of quite high levels of need in some communities. And somewhat against the prevailing narrative, there was a lot of attention to the number of people that signed up to some of the national schemes like NHS volunteers, and this oversupply of volunteers there, whereas the majority of community groups were saying that they had fewer active volunteers during lockdown than they had previously. And so some of the reasons for that were people shielding, and a lot of groups have a large proportion of older volunteers, so they're more likely to be in those more vulnerable categories and perhaps less likely to adapt to technology. And only 8% had seen a greater supply of volunteers. There's some other challenges that people raised. There's obviously been a highly emotional experience for a lot of groups and the people they work with. So lots of concern about maintaining engagement, especially with vulnerable young people. And children and young people were the most common beneficiary of grantees from the Tesco emergency funds. So lots of groups working with young people and concerned about what was happening to them, and a large amount of uncertainty about the future, both what was going to happen in their communities and how people would cope, and also how their group would survive given the financial impact. So we looked at what groups were actually doing during lockdown. Lots of groups were involved in food delivery, whether that was food banks who kind of scaling up and offering home delivery services for the first time, or other groups that were working with vulnerable people and sort of said, right, we're going to get involved in making sure that you get the food that you need and other essentials like medicines, and making sure that they had needs. For example, some groups were working with autistic children and saying, actually, these families don't get the official response in terms of food delivery packs, but their children have quite specific needs that they won't eat particular things, and as a community group we can help make sure that those needs are met during lockdown. Lots of groups were supporting mental health and wellbeing and been keeping in touch both with volunteers and people in the community. Lots had adapted to remote delivery, so working through phone and online sessions and activity packs. There were a lot of comments like, oh, who knew it was so easy? People saying that, you know, they could have done this before, but they had never had the kind of impetus to innovate, and actually there were some benefits that suited some people more, so that hadn't all been negative, though of course others saying, you know, we want to get back to seeing people face to face when we can, because it's not ideal for everyone, and there's that concern about digital exclusion. About half said they've been collaborating with other organisations, and had a few people saying that actually local partnership working had really improved where they were as a result of lockdown, and they were hoping that that would continue in the future. And lots of groups were just adapting by making the frontline services that they can't deliver remotely or stop, to making those safe, getting access to PPE or different spaces that would allow them to continue their work. And almost 44% said that there have been some changes that they've made that were positive and that they hope they would continue. And further 38% were unsure if this was the case back in June. So there had been some things that were positive that coming out of it, despite all the challenges. 45% of groups said they were extremely or very confident about continuing the project in the future. And we did a similar survey in spring 2009, and that was 60%. So are perhaps seeing less confidence and certainty about the future. I think that reflects the concerns about finances and the practical considerations. But most do say that think that their community group can play an important role in rebuilding and recovery, helping people to rebuild the confidence to interact with others safely, supporting those who've been negatively affected by the pandemic, whether that's physical and mental health, their finances, being able to access services again, and some that are hoping for a legacy of more community spirit and neighbourliness. And we asked what kind of support groups need to achieve their goals in the future. And again, this is a comparison to a survey that we did that asked the same question in spring 2019, which was a smaller survey. So probably some caveats on that comparison, but I thought it was interesting that grant funding was really the most important thing to people this summer, whereas in the past there was more of an even split between different types of supports.
2 minutes, Fay.
Okay. Yeah, and then also buildings or outside space sort of counterintuitively have become more important to people, perhaps because their needs with regard to that had changed, and people more focused on finding outdoor space where they can continue in line with social distancing. But in general, yeah, the picture was a real big focus on grant funding, which may reflect the fact that we have our initial relationship with a lot of these groups would be as a funder, so it's possible that they respond to us differently than they would to someone else, but it seems to be a big concern. So we're sort of early stage of working out what this research means, but it is a snapshot of a picture that's evolving very fast, but it shows that the kind of creativity and innovation that can exist even with small grassroots community groups and the potential they have. Shows that many groups want to play an active role in supporting people through a protracted period of recovery, with a lot of concerns about the future and whether they'll be able to do that in the way that they want to. And thought there was potential for community groups to be better networked locally so that excess volunteer capacity can be directed towards groups that need it. Obviously, local voluntary sector infrastructure bodies in some areas I know have been doing a lot of that and doing that well, but in other areas it seems like some community groups aren't networked into that. That's here to explore. And lastly, that concern about funding. So there's been some short-term funds that don't seem to have been meeting the level of need around grassroots community groups, and there's a risk if those groups aren't able to fundraise in the future in the way they have in the past, and that funds not available for elsewhere, that this layer of social infrastructure could be eroded and leaving many communities out without the kind of support that they've had in the past.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fay. Thank you for that, looking at community action in the pandemic. And now, last but not least, we're going to turn to Patty, and Patty Doran from the UK Data Service is going to talk to us about the topic of social surveys are now more important than ever. What can the data tell us? And I'm looking forward to this, seeing lots of things from the UK Data Service recently. So thank you, Patty.
Kia ora, Carolyn, thank you very much. I'm Patty Doran from the UK Data Service, and this is a bit different to some of the other presentations we've had so far, but in the theme of cross-cutting issues, it fits in. And just to carry on Carolyn's theme, I'm going to start then with a whakatauki, a Māori proverb. Hea hate mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It's probably the most common and well-used proverb in Aotearoa, New Zealand. What's the most important thing in the world? It's the people, it's the people, it's the people. And so although we've got cross-cutting issues being discussed in this section, the session today, I think they all come back to the people, they all come back to community, and they all come back to how we can contribute. So I think that whakatauki sort of summarises perhaps what this session might be about. So just as an overview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to set my timer as well. I'm going to quickly talk about, introduce the UK Data Service for anyone who's not aware of it, and talk about the sort of data that we hold. I'm going to then talk about how data can be used to provide context to the pandemic and give some examples of how that has been used recently. Then I'm going to introduce some of new survey data, which has been produced very rapidly to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's quite exciting data that's coming out from some of the big national surveys. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about how you could use data to support the work you do and your organisations. So the UK Data Service is a comprehensive resource funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. So it's a single point of access for a wide range of secondary social science data. And we at the UK Data Service facilitate access to that data, and we also provide a range of support, training and guidance. The sort of data that we hold can be sort of grouped into three sort of different groups really. We've got aggregate data, so data that's already been sort of grouped together by different topics or themes. The most common there would be the census data. We hold all the census data going back to the 70s, 1971, and that's census data for England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. We hold a lot of micro data, so this is quantitative data. Most of it comes from UK surveys. Those are social surveys, it's sort of longitudinal surveys as well. And we do also have some other data. So we do have a qualitative data bank. Quite a lot of qualitative studies are stored with us. There's also a bit of business data and mixed methods data. So we have thousands of data sets deposited with us, and most of it is free to use for anyone that's using it. Well, it's all free to use as long as you're not using it for commercial purposes. So early on in the pandemic, I co-wrote a blog about how social survey data is more important now than ever. I'm quite passionate about using data to give an accurate context to social situations. And so that's how our social survey data can be used. So even if the data is not specifically about experiences during COVID, it helps frame the issues that are important at this time. So a couple of the examples that we used in the blog, this one came from a blog written by Morgan Vine from Independent Age. It was published in National Voices, and just around the start of lockdown, they had produced a report which had been a piece of work that had been carried out over the preceding year in 2019, but the findings from the report they thought were quite relevant to sort of putting in context the situation of older people during COVID-19. They'd carried out a mixed method study, so they'd interviewed older people, but they'd also used data from Understanding Society. Understanding Society is a longitudinal household panel study that's held by the UK Data Service, and it interviews several thousand households, and it goes back to the households and measures them over time. And so from that data, they could look at the experiences of older people and how they compared when you looked at different demographics. So if you looked at older people with physical health conditions, you could see that they were much less likely to visit socially with friends and family. And that's what this data here on the side is showing. But I really like this report. I'm a mixed methods researcher. If I'm working in my ideal situation. So they aligned the quantitative data with the qualitative data from their interviews. So it was a really nice report where the data just supported their qualitative findings and helped, and the blog then focused it on the needs of older people during the pandemic. Another example came from the Intergenerational Foundation. Similarly, they had recently produced a report. Their report was based on the English Housing Survey, and they were looking at inequalities within households and access to space, which of course became a very important issue once we were in lockdown, and all of a sudden we're all in our houses, and of course that is not equal. Some people have bigger houses, some people have smaller houses, some people have gardens, some people don't. And this graph from data from the English Housing Survey, it's a bit hard to read, but it's age groups down the bottom. So it goes from 16 to 29, 30 to 44, 45 to 64, and 65 and older. The bright red columns is the median floor area in a house, so how big the total house is, and the dark red column is per person. So you can see if you're in a younger household or in the middle age where you probably have families, there's much less room per person in the house. But houses are also smaller because when you first get on the housing ladder, you tend to have a smaller house. And as you get older, perhaps you get moved to a larger house. So you can see the inequality across ages, particularly for these age groups who were in homes with more people and less space. So they used that research they'd done to highlight inequalities that were raised as part of the pandemic. But what's perhaps more exciting, there was lots of talk yesterday, particularly about evidence at the conference. And the new data that's coming out, I think, is very exciting. So available now from the UK Data Service, we've got new rapid response surveys to the COVID-19 pandemic. There's the COVID-19 survey in 5 national longitudinal cohort studies. So in the UK, we're very fortunate to have a repository of very robust longitudinal cohort studies. So each of these studies has followed a group of individuals from birth across their life course. So there's the 1946 study, and then it kind of goes every 12 years. So that's children born in 1946. And then it moves through to the millennium cohort study, those born around the millennium. And then there's a next step study as well with slightly younger children. And the people in charge of those surveys have gone to their cohort and asked them specific questions about their experience during the lockdown. And so that's quite rich data there. Understanding Society, again, the same one that I mentioned earlier, has also had a specific COVID-19 study. So they've gone to their household panelists, and they've got 42,000 people that they've contacted as part of that study and asked them questions about their experience. And another very big study that we have is the quarterly labour force survey. So that goes to a group of people, the same group of people over 5 quarters, and then it rotates through, and they ask them about their experience of work and life. It's quite a rich data set, and as you can see, it's a very large number of people that they contact, so that's 69,000. The quarterly labour force survey hasn't asked questions specific to experiences of COVID-19, but it's been carried out through the lockdown, so you'll be able to see what people's experiences were at that time. There's other data that will be emerging. We hold the English longitudinal study of ageing, and that has ongoing work at the moment with the COVID-19 module. The opinions and lifestyle study is also available. That data is available directly from their website, and the ONS time use survey is also available from the ONS, looking at how people have spent their time under lockdown. So lots of interesting data coming out. These are the sort of topics that are covered. So when you talk about social surveys, it's not just straight demographics. There's all sorts of questions about caring responsibilities, about loneliness. I'm particularly interested in loneliness and social support. Things about homeschooling, lots of information coming out about schooling and how much schooling children have been given. Some of the headlines that you've heard about, perhaps mothers spending more time and taking a step back from work in order to school their children. That has come from some of these studies. Mental well-being, physical well-being, and then neighbourhood cohesion. And most recently added to this has been volunteering, which I thought was worth highlighting today. The Understanding Society COVID-19 study has been happening every month. So it happened April, May, June. The July survey hasn't been published yet, but across the different surveys in the different months, they introduced different modules. So in the July survey, they had a volunteering module. So they asked, oh, and I feel like I need another voice to say these questions, but they asked the following questions. They asked, since March 2020, have you given any unpaid help or worked as a volunteer for any type of local, national, or international organisation or charity? Why have you been doing this? How have you been doing this? And how many hours? So I think that's going to provide us with quite a lot of interesting data on how people have volunteered and why. And that data is due to be released in September. But some of the data, yep, thank you. Some of the data has been released already, and some reports have been produced. So for example, the Centre for Longitudinal Studies at UCL have produced information, a report on how hours worked have dropped during lockdown and the sort of the effects of furlough. They've also broken that down by age and gender. So you can see here in these middle graphs, it's women in their 30s to 40s, 50s who have reported being much worse off or a little worse off or just generally worse off in terms of finances since the pandemic. Another report has come from the data producers of Understanding Society, looking at ethnic differences across households. Their report is very interesting. They looked by different minority groups and looked at the changes from the pre-pandemic data from Understanding Society and compared it to their specific survey that came out during the pandemic to look at changes. And the first one here's mental health. So you can see mental health has gone down for Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian groups, but it's actually kind of gone up a little bit for Black African, Black Caribbean, but they had a lower baseline, so that data needs to be sort of considered by looking at the full report. And this one here was more interesting. It was looking at neighbourhood communication, and neighbourhood communication's gone down across all groups, as you'd expect with sort of being locked down, but it's more so for Pakistani, Bangladeshi than anyone else, which kind of goes against some of the news stories that were coming out saying that those people in those groups are still socialising a lot. So just to finish on where to find the data, we've produced a specific COVID-19 page on our website. So if you go to the UK Data Service website, go to Get Data, Data by Theme. There's a theme now for COVID-19, and you'll find links to all those data sets I talked about there. And just want to say that we've got a couple of dates coming up. On the 22nd to 23rd of October, we're having a data dive. So this is a free one day, I think it was one day, I don't know why I've got 2 dates there, but that's what I was given this morning by my communications manager. This is a date when we'll be looking at the data in depth. You can come along and be supported to work out how the data works and see what you can find. It's generally good fun. Normally we have them face to face and we eat pizza, but that will be virtually, so we'll see how that goes. And also we've got a Festival of Social Science event happening in November, specifically aimed at the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, looking at how you can use data to do good in your organisation. So that's us. More details available on the UK Data Service website, or you can contact us through any of those channels. So, no data.